We saw images last night as a search warrant was served about 2 miles from Guthrie's home, and it appeared several people were detained. However, Fox's Matt Finn has learned much more about the outcome as he's been speaking very closely there with the sheriff in Pima County. And Matt, what have you been able to learn?
Well, the sheriff tells us that there are no arrests and no one in custody after last night's pretty intense law enforcement presence about 2 miles from where I'm standing. We caution that could change, at any hour. Someone could be arrested or, there could be additional people taken into custody. But, this was the second time in a matter of a couple of days where we saw this really large law enforcement and SWAT team presence. The previous one was a few days ago down in Rio Rico, Arizona, which is closer to the Mexico border. And the person there was detained for questioning. They searched his home. They took a cell phone, but ultimately he was released pretty quickly. He is not being labeled a suspect. And after that, the sheriff kind of gave us this warning that they may be taking in all types of people for questioning. None of them may be arrested, and none of them may be labeled suspects. And we are seeing a pattern here where if law enforcement at the sheriff's office is targeting someone, even if it's just for questioning, we're seeing this huge response, this SWAT team response. So the FBI is also assisting. We have not heard from the FBI yet on this matter. I'd be curious to see what they have to say after all of the events that unfolded last night. But as it stands right now, no public suspects, no persons of interest listed, and the sheriff's office has warned that they're going to continue to question people based on tips and leads and all types of evidence that they're not sharing with us. So we may see, this huge show of force again, and it may simply result in questioning.
And Matt, I wanted to ask you, because I know one of the topics of conversation over the last 24 to 48 hours has been essentially that relationship between the Pima County Sheriff's Office and the FBI. And I know you talked to the sheriff about that a little bit, and he told you things for the most part appear fine, right?
Yeah, I talked to the sheriff and the FBI about some of the reporting and insinuations that the FBI and the sheriff's office are not getting along here on the ground. Both agencies tell me that they're actually sitting next to each other in the command post, that they are getting along within the command post. The sheriff told me, there are issues that come up, and sometimes the FBI wins, sometimes the sheriff wins, but in general, the sheriff insists that they have good synergy here. One thing we can pinpoint or point to is the matter of ongoing evidence. So the sheriff here tells me that for decades they have been using an independent lab to send their material to. The sheriff says once the investigation began here at Nancy Guthrie's house, they began sending their evidence to that independent lab, which I believe is actually in Florida. The sheriff says they have a contract with this lab. And then as new evidence started coming in, for example, there was a glove recovered not too far from the scene. It seems like the FBI asked for that glove to be sent to Quantico, probably saying it's the gold standard, it's the best lab in the country. But the sheriff's office insisted that any new evidence continues to go to its private lab, telling me because they already have some of their evidence there, and they also have the Guthrie family DNA swabs and other people's swabs, including people who have been on Nancy's property. And so the sheriff says it only makes sense to keep sending everything there so that it can immediately be checked against all the DNA swabs that we have. And also, the sheriff says it doesn't make sense to separate the evidence between two different labs for obvious reasons. So the sheriff insists that everything is going along fine. Now, look, we know that a lot of times the locals and the feds, they butt heads. And, the head of the FBI, or at least the spokesperson for the FBI here, and the head of the sheriff's office tell me they're getting along. But a lot of times it's agents on the ground who give us, different stories or different accounts. And so maybe the agents would tell you a different story, that they're not really getting along. But we know that's kind of common. So, in general, as of this morning, we haven't heard anything else about them not being on the same page. We believe that they actually were in partnership last night, and we're actually waiting to hear from the FBI if it's going to say anything about what happened last night here in the Tucson area. Back to you.
And Matt, my last question here before I let you go, wanted to ask you, as you mentioned the DNA, the swabs there, one thing we heard from the sheriff is that essentially it appears that the DNA that was found on the property does not belong to Nancy or anyone close to her. Do we have any additional information about that, or is it pretty much a mystery?
So the sheriff tells me that the blood found on the sidewalk behind me is Nancy's. Then he initially told me that they did find DNA inside of the house. And then he later told another Fox reporter that there is DNA inside the house that does not belong to Nancy. And so that's all we know about that. It's not clear what type of DNA it was, whether it was hair or blood, but the sheriff says they do have DNA that does not belong to Nancy. Not clear how critical that's going to be, because there's all types of people who may have been in and out of that house. The sheriff didn't say that DNA is, specifically linked to a suspect. Back to you.